A soldier named Jordan returned from an overseas war with his unit to a barracks in Texas. Hours later, during their victory celebration, he vanished inside the building. No one saw him leave. No answers. 5 years later, workers opened a hidden space in the same barracks and found a human bone with Jordan's tag still attached. The question is, who put him there? The night the soldiers returned to their barracks in Texas, the base was loud with celebration. They had just survived a brutal overseas war, one that many believed they wouldn't make it out of alive. Among the returning unit was Jordan, a disciplined and respected soldier who had fought side by side with his brothers through months of chaos. When their transport trucks rolled into the barracks compound, cheers erupted. Music played. Drinks flowed. Soldiers laughed like men who had just outrun death. But before the night was over, Jordan vanished. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe he went to rest. Maybe he stepped outside. Maybe he needed time alone after the horrors of war. But by morning, his bunk was untouched. His phone was gone. His uniform locker was still open. And the last people who claimed to see him told completely different stories. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into years. The army quietly closed the case, listing Jordan as missing. Then, 5 years later, during a routine renovation inside the same barracks, workers opened a sealed maintenance crawlspace. Inside it, they found a human bone, and the identification tag still attached to it carried one name: Jordan. The convoy rolled through the gates of the military barracks in Texas just after sunset. Engines rumbled, tires crunched over gravel, and exhausted soldiers leaned back in their seats as if their bodies were finally remembering what rest felt like. They had survived months of brutal combat overseas. For many of them, simply being back on American soil felt unreal. Among the unit was Jordan, a quiet but respected soldier who had earned the trust of everyone in his squad. He wasn't the loudest man in the group, but when things got dangerous during the mission, Jordan was always the one people followed. As the truck stopped inside the barracks compound, cheers erupted. Some soldiers jumped down from the vehicles and hugged each other. Others pulled out their phones to call family members they hadn't spoken to in months. Laughter echoed through the compound. That night, the barracks turned into a celebration. Music blasted from a speaker someone dragged into the common room. Bottles appeared from lockers. Soldiers who had stared death in the face only days earlier were now shouting victory chants and telling exaggerated war stories. Jordan was there too, smiling, talking with his squad. But sometime later that night, without a single scream, without anyone noticing, Jordan disappeared inside the barracks. And the strange part, several soldiers would later swear they saw him after the time he supposedly vanished. Morning came quietly over the barracks in Texas. The loud celebration from the night before had faded into the usual groans of soldiers waking up with headaches and sore bodies. Empty bottles sat on tables. Chairs were overturned. Someone's music speaker still hummed softly before the battery finally died. Most of the unit slowly returned to their normal routines. But in one corner of the barracks, something was wrong. Jordan's bunk was untouched. His blanket was still neatly folded from the day they arrived. His boots sat under the bed exactly the way he always placed them, side by side, perfectly straight. His locker door, however, was slightly open. At first, his roommate assumed Jordan had gone out early. Maybe a morning run. Maybe to the mess hall. But by noon, people started asking questions. Anybody seen Jordan? A few soldiers shrugged. One claimed he saw Jordan leaving the common room around midnight. Another insisted Jordan had walked toward the maintenance hallway near the back of the building. Then a third soldier said something that made the room go silent. "I saw him around 2 in the morning," he said slowly. "He was standing near the stairwell, just staring down the hallway." "Did you talk to him?" someone asked. The soldier shook his head. No, something about him felt off. And after that moment, no one ever saw Jordan again. By the second day of Jordan's disappearance, the mood inside the barracks in Texas had completely changed. The celebration was gone. In its place was tension. Military police arrived early that morning, sealing off sections of the building and questioning everyone who had been present the night the soldiers returned from overseas. What had started as a simple missing person concern quickly turned into something far more serious. Soldiers were called into a small office one by one. "Tell us the last time you saw Jordan." At first, the answers sounded normal. One soldier claimed Jordan was laughing with the group around 11:30 p.m. Another said he saw Jordan walk out of the common room alone shortly after midnight. But as more interviews continued, the timeline began to fall apart. One soldier swore Jordan had walked toward the back hallway, the area that led to old maintenance rooms and storage spaces that were rarely used. Another insisted he saw Jordan arguing quietly with someone near the stairwell. But when investigators asked who he was arguing with, the soldier hesitated. "I couldn't see the other person clearly," he said. Then came the most disturbing detail. Security cameras at the barracks entrance showed every soldier who entered that night. But after midnight, there was no footage of Jordan leaving the building. Which meant one thing. Somewhere inside that barracks, Jordan had vanished without a trace. Once investigators confirmed that Jordan never left the barracks in Texas, the situation escalated quickly. The entire building was locked down. Military police and investigators began a full search of the barracks. Every room was opened. Lockers were checked. Storage areas were cleared. Soldiers were ordered to remain outside while trained teams combed through the building inch by inch. At first, the search felt routine. But as the hours passed, something unsettling began to grow. Jordan's personal items were still inside the building. His duffel bag sat beside his bunk. His military documents were still in his locker. Even his phone charger was plugged into the wall next to his bed. It looked as if he had planned to sleep there that night. Then investigators reached the back maintenance corridor. It was a narrow hallway that most soldiers barely used. Dim lights flickered above old pipes running across the ceiling. Several doors led to utility rooms and crawl spaces that maintenance crews occasionally used. One of the investigators noticed something strange. A faint scratch mark near a metal maintenance door. When they pulled it open, the room inside was empty. Just pipes, dust, and old equipment. No sign of Jordan. But the investigator couldn't shake a strange feeling. The building had been searched from top to bottom. Yet somehow, Jordan had disappeared inside it. And the deeper investigators looked into the soldiers' stories, the more it seemed that someone inside the barracks was hiding something. The investigation inside the barracks in Texas stretched into weeks. At first, commanders believed Jordan had simply wandered off during the celebration. Maybe he left the base unnoticed. Maybe he needed space after the horrors of war. But the evidence kept pointing in a darker direction. Investigators brought the soldiers back in for second interviews. This time, the questions were more direct. Did anyone argue with Jordan that night? Was he having problems with someone in the unit? Did anything unusual happen before he disappeared? The soldiers' answers started to shift. One man who previously said he saw Jordan walking toward the back hallway now claimed he wasn't sure anymore. Another soldier who mentioned a quiet argument suddenly said he might have been mistaken. To the investigators, it felt like the entire unit was closing ranks. Then something disturbing surfaced. A soldier admitted that earlier that night, Jordan had been involved in a heated confrontation in the common room. The argument had been intense, but strangely, no one could agree on who the other person was. Even worse, when investigators reviewed the security footage from that evening, they found something odd. At 1:47 a.m., The hallway camera near the maintenance corridor briefly flickered. The video cut out for almost 30 seconds. When the feed returned, the hallway was empty, and Jordan was never seen again. Weeks after Jordan vanished from the barracks in Texas, the official investigation had reached a dead end. There were no fingerprints suggesting a struggle. No blood. No witnesses who could clearly explain what happened. Eventually, the military scaled the investigation back. Jordan was officially listed as missing in action within the base, a classification that left many questions unanswered. But inside the barracks, the soldiers began whispering about something far more disturbing. It started with one quiet rumor. A private claimed that during the celebration that night, Jordan had accused someone in the unit of doing something terrible during their overseas mission, something that could have destroyed careers and possibly sent someone to prison. At first, the story sounded like drunken gossip. But then another soldier quietly admitted something similar. He remembered Jordan arguing with a small group of men near the stairwell shortly before midnight. They were telling him to let it go, the soldier said. When investigators tried to confirm the story, the soldiers involved refused to talk. No one admitted to the argument. No one admitted to threatening Jordan. And without evidence, the case slowly faded into silence. Months turned into years. The barracks continued operating as usual in Texas. Jordan's bunk was eventually assigned to someone else. But 5 years later, during a routine renovation project inside the same building, workers would open a space that had been sealed for years. And inside it, they would discover something that would reopen the entire case. 5 years passed. Life inside the military barracks in Texas moved on, just like it always does in the military. New soldiers arrived. Others were transferred to different bases. The night Jordan disappeared slowly faded into an old story that only a few people still talked about. Officially, the case remained unresolved. Jordan was still listed as missing. Then one afternoon, during a renovation project, construction workers began repairing old plumbing lines inside the building. The project required them to open several sealed maintenance crawlspaces that hadn't been touched in years. One of the workers removed a metal panel near the back maintenance corridor. Behind it was a narrow crawlspace filled with dust, pipes, and insulation. At first, nothing seemed unusual. But when the worker shined his flashlight deeper into the space, something caught his eye. A small object partially buried beneath old debris. He reached inside and carefully pulled it out. It was a human bone. The room went silent. Work immediately stopped, and military police were called to the scene. When investigators examined the crawlspace more carefully, they made a horrifying discovery. The bone wasn't the only thing hidden there. There were several more human remains scattered deep inside the narrow space. And attached to one of them was a military identification tag. The name engraved on it made investigators freeze. Jordan. The discovery of Jordan's remains inside the crawlspace shocked the entire base in Texas. Within hours, the barracks was sealed off again, just like it had been 5 years earlier. Military police, forensic teams, and investigators flooded the building, carefully examining the narrow crawlspace where the bones had been found. What they uncovered was chilling. Jordan's remains were hidden deep behind the maintenance wall, in a section that was almost impossible to access without removing the metal panel first. It wasn't a place someone could simply wander into by accident. Someone had put him there. Forensic experts confirmed something even more disturbing. The remains showed signs that Jordan had suffered severe trauma before his death. This was no accident. This was murder. With this discovery, investigators reopened every interview from 5 years earlier. They pulled old statements, re-examined security footage, and began tracking down the soldiers who had been stationed in the barracks that night. Many of them had since moved to different bases. Some had left the military entirely. But when investigators started contacting them again, something strange happened. A few soldiers suddenly refused to speak. One former member of the unit reportedly told investigators something chilling before ending the call. Some things that happened that night were never supposed to come out. And for the first time in 5 years, the question returned. Who inside that barracks killed Jordan? After the discovery of Jordan's remains in the barracks in Texas, investigators pushed harder than ever to uncover what truly happened that night. They began tracking down every soldier who had been stationed in the building 5 years earlier. Some were still serving in the military. Others had moved on to civilian life across different states. Most of them repeated the same story they had given years ago. They remembered the celebration. They remembered the music. They remembered Jordan being there. But no one claimed to know how he died. Then, one former soldier finally agreed to speak. The interview took place in a quiet office far from the barracks. At first, the man seemed nervous, constantly glancing at the door as if someone might walk in. Finally, he leaned forward and said something investigators had suspected for years. That night, Jordan threatened to report something that happened during the overseas mission. According to the soldier, a small group of men in the unit had done something illegal during the war, something that could have ended their careers and possibly sent them to prison. Jordan had confronted them about it during the celebration. The argument grew heated, and then the soldier said the words investigators had been waiting 5 years to hear. They didn't mean to kill him, but the fight got out of control. And after Jordan stopped moving, panic took over. The men dragged his body into the maintenance corridor and hid it inside the crawlspace. For 5 years, they believed no one would ever find him. The confession changed everything. Within weeks, military investigators began building a case around what had happened inside the barracks in Texas 5 years earlier. The soldier who spoke first eventually identified the group involved in the confrontation with Jordan that night. One by one, the men were tracked down and questioned again. This time, the pressure was different. Investigators now had Jordan's remains, forensic evidence from the crawlspace, and a witness who had finally broken the silence. Slowly, the story began to line up. According to the investigation, Jordan had confronted several members of his unit during the celebration after returning from their overseas mission. He had threatened to report what he believed were serious violations committed during the war. The argument turned violent in the hallway near the maintenance corridor. What started as shouting quickly turned into a fight. Jordan was struck during the struggle and collapsed. When the soldiers realized he was no longer moving, panic set in. Instead of reporting the incident, they made a decision that would haunt them for years. They hid his body inside the crawlspace behind the maintenance wall. But 5 years later, the renovation project exposed the truth. The soldiers responsible were eventually charged under military law, finally bringing some measure of justice for Jordan. Yet many who served in that barracks still say the same thing today. The most terrifying part wasn't the crime itself. It was how an entire unit stayed silent for 5 years. 5 years. That's how long Jordan's secret stayed hidden inside a barracks in Texas. For 5 years, soldiers walked past that maintenance wall without knowing the truth that was buried behind it. For 5 years, his family lived with a painful question of what really happened the night he came home from war. The men responsible believed the celebration, the silence, and the years passing would bury the truth forever. But sometimes the truth has a way of finding its way out, no matter how deeply it's hidden. A simple renovation project exposed what an entire group had kept secret. And Jordan finally got the justice that had been denied to him for half a decade. Stories like this remind us that some of the darkest crimes don't happen on the battlefield. They happen in the places where people are supposed to trust each other the most. If this story shocked you, make sure you follow for more true crime cases, unsolved mysteries, and dark stories that many people have never heard about. And tell me in the comments, do you think the other soldiers who stayed silent were just as guilty, or were they simply too afraid to speak?